bullets, screams, and death on the highway. What you just saw is a confrontation between Mexican soldiers and Los Zetas, the feared criminal gang led by El Verdugo, one of the bloodiest bosses in history. We are referring to Heriberto Lascano, who earned that nickname by murdering, mutilating, and decapitating his enemies. In this new installment of Military, might we want to review his career and how he managed to become the main head of a beast that forever changed drug trafficking in Latin America. We warn you that it will be a trip to the bowels of organized crime, with stories and grotesque images that could cause repulsion in sensitive stomachs. Let's begin. The protagonist of this video is not only one of the most ruthless assassins, but his life is full of mysteries and contradictions. Some police versions indicate that Heriberto Lascano was born in 1974 in Acatlan, Coahuila State. However, other documents date his birth in 1975 in Apan, Hidalgo. What is certain is that on June 5, 1991, Lascano enlisted in the ranks of the Mexican Army. His career within the force was not brief. He spent 7 years there training as a state element. The problem is that at some point in the mid-90s, he came into contact with the world of drug trafficking, and not by fighting it, but by allowing himself to be seduced by the luxuries and excesses of that field. Thus, on March 27, 1998, he requested his discharge from the service, according to the records of the SEDENA, or Secretariat of National Defense. The files show that at the time of his departure he had reached the rank of infantry corporal. Unfortunately, that long period of military training was put at the service of the worst gang of hitmen in the history of Mexico. What better letter of introduction than to reproduce one of his many video threats?
Este es un mensaje de parte de todos los Zetas de Ciudad Victoria para entrar a Tamaulipas y en especialmente a Ciudad Victoria. Pidan permiso, pinches ojetes. Ciudad Victoria es territorio Zeta.
But how did they become synonymous with evil? Since the late 1990s, the historic Gulf Cartel led by Ociel Cardenas Guillen sought to be on par with the rest of the competition in terms of assassins and the level of violence they were capable of carrying out. That is why the CDG decided to turn to a former military man, Arturo Guzman de Sena, to form an elite commando from corrupt military elements. De Sena's job was to recruit the most ferocious soldiers to later transform them into hitmen at the service of drug trafficking. Among the individuals contacted in that search process was Heriberto Lascano. The shock force that was being formed was none other than the infamous Zetas, a word that even today strikes terror into the hearts of every Mexican. El Verdugo was part of the original group, the first 14 hitmen with military training who were recruited by De Sena, alias Z1, to serve the Gulf Cartel. For a time they were just a cell dependent on the orders of Ociel Cardenas Guillen, but the 21st century brought with it much turbulence in the drug trafficking business. When De Sena died in an armed confrontation in 2002, he was succeeded by Rogelio González Pizana, the Z2. His reign did not last long, as he was captured in 2004 in an operation carried out by the Mexican Navy. Then, it was Heriberto Lascano's time to command Los Zetas. It was from this position of power that he forged his legend as one of the most feared bosses in the entire country. The relationship between the Gulf Cartel and the men of El Verdugo began to become increasingly tense. In 2007, a negotiation between the CDG and its sworn enemy, the Sinaloa cartel, did not please Lascano at all, so he held an internal consultation among his men to find out their opinion on the matter. The Zetas hated the Sinaloa hitmen, with whom they had brutal confrontations and maintained a war without quarter. For them, this rapprochement was like a betrayal. The final break with the Gulf Cartel occurred in 2010 due to a series of murders and arrests that raised suspicions and distrust to the maximum. From that moment on, the Zetas became an independent and rapidly growing cartel determined to take Mexico by storm. All this thanks to their military training, the use of guerrilla warfare tactics, and the extreme cruelty they professed to send their messages. In many ways, this front was the first to systematize the decapitation of its enemies as a strategy of intimidation. These practices were devised and promoted by Lescano. Not even the special unit known as Los Talibanes at the service of the CDG was able to contain the fury of these hitmen.
Nombre completo.
Julián Castro Rangel.
¿Cómo te apodan?
Guante ruso cachete.
¿A qué grupo delincuencial perteneces?
A los talibanes.
¿Qué lugar ocupas ahí?
Guante regional de Zacatecas.
Esto es un ejemplo.
This is bloody and very graphic material, so we cannot show you much more about how the tortuous interrogation ended. Even so, you can surely imagine the kind of death that the hitmen inflicted on their enemy, an employee of the Gulf. As the absolute leader of Los Zetas, Lescano also intensified the violent confrontation against the Sinaloa cartel. His main objective was to prevent El Chapo Guzman and his people from establishing themselves in the state of Tamaulipas. It was too important an area for the trafficking of illegal substances to give up the million-dollar profits that this territory provided. This led to wild confrontations in the streets of the main cities of the state, causing hundreds of civilian casualties. At the same time, there was an exponential increase in the use of narco banners and the display of body parts in central areas. A new era had begun in the history of Aztec organized crime. The images below correspond to a battle that took place in Tamaulipas. The protagonists, the Mexican army resisting the fire of Zeta soldiers. This is what we mean by guerrilla warfare tactics. El Verdugo's men would often ambush the authorities, favoring surprise shootouts from the sides to maximize their damage capacity. These hitmen not only knew when to attack, but also when to retreat to avoid painful defeats or being outnumbered by the enemy. Under Lescano's leadership, the Zetas were organized in a structure in which lower-ranking members had little knowledge of large-scale operations. They only knew that they had to accomplish their missions no matter what, and with no regard for the amount of blood that had to be shed to do so. They were involved in kidnappings, extortion, oil theft, drug trafficking, and also charged piso, or taxes, on drugs that passed through their territory. During El Verdugo's command, the Zetas' operations stretched from the US-Mexico border to Guatemala and Central America. They planted their flag in at least 10 Mexican states, but their business was centered in the northeast of the country. One of the most sinister qualities of Lescano is that he is one of the few criminal bosses who managed to return from the dead. This criminal was reported dead on September 5, 2007, after a confrontation with elements of the Navy in Tamaulipas. It was assumed that he had been hit by rifle and machine gun fire. According to official records of that day, the boss died like so many of his subordinates in combat. However, it was later learned that this was not true. Lescano managed to escape the shootout and continued to command Los Zetas until October 7, 2012, the date of his second death. But we will deal with this later, since there are some incredible details that you should know first. Lescano is considered responsible for thousands of murders and is thought to have been the triggerman for dozens of homicides of rival drug dealers, police officers, and journalist Francisco Ortiz Franco, co-editor of the weekly Zeta. The latter is part of a long and infamous tradition whereby journalists are one of the main targets of drug traffickers, the idea being to shoot down those who reveal their business or publish compromising photographs that are useful for justice. The main problem for Los Zetas is that they were fighting a war on two fronts. First, Lescano's soldiers were fighting the Sinaloa cartel in the squares of Tamaulipas. At the same time, they had to confront government agents such as the army and the police. The following video looks like a war scene, but it was recorded by security elements who battled against criminals. This is the level of violence we are referring to. Given this demand, it became necessary to develop a strategy of alliances if they wanted to remain standing as a major competitor to the throne of drug trafficking. News reports dated September 2008 indicate that El Verdugo reached a collaboration agreement with important figures such as the Beltran Leyva brothers and Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, the main leader of the Juarez cartel. Over time, internal tensions arose that weakened the functioning of this elite group of hitmen. That is why, in July 2012, Los Zetas split into two factions that fought each other, one led by El Verdugo and the other by a leader of the organization, Miguel Trevino Morales, alias Z40. It was reported that at that time Lascano was out of Mexico, while the faction still loyal to him was being organized by his right-hand man, Ivan Velázquez Caballero, alias El Taliban. Unfortunately for El Verdugo, Velázquez was captured in September 2012 in the state of San Luis de Potosí. Mexican authorities described Lascano as a violent killer, and it was even rumored that he kept wild animals such as tigers and lions on one of his properties, which he had sometimes fed to his victims. This is why he was wanted by institutions in the United States and Mexico for multiple murders and drug trafficking charges. In total, $5 million were offered for information leading to his capture. The curious thing is that according to Ruben Trejo, then mayor of Coahuila, one of Lascano's strongholds, they had no idea what was going on.
Pues aquí no conocemos, inmediatamente que si vemos gente extraña tenemos que conocerla, o sea, yo que diga yo no vi gente extraña.
It is hard to believe that such activities went unnoticed, even more so if we take into account the brutal methods of this subject. Regarding the aggressive and bloodthirsty character of El Verdugo, there are many versions, but one of the most widespread was the one that maintained that this criminal leader committed acts of cannibalism against his enemies. Just as you heard, the drug lord devoured human flesh as part of his demonstration of power and cruelty. According to testimony from one of his collaborators, Juan Sanchez Limon, he said that his former boss prepared his victims before eating them. During an interview conducted in the Puente Grande prison, Jalisco, a reporter asked Sanchez Limon if the myths surrounding the image of Lascano were true. The answer was incredible. I know that he has a ranch with a zoo, but I have not heard that he throws his enemies to the lions. Rather, he executes them quickly. Then he eats them, he swallows them, so you understand me. According to the accounts of the arrested criminal, he himself was in meetings in which the capo prepared his infamous banquets of human flesh. Before executing his victims, he ordered them to bathe and shave their entire body. Afterwards, he let them calm down and even made them drink whiskey to relax more in order to soften their tissues. After this good treatment, the moment of brutality arrived. Lascano ordered that the person be executed quickly so that adrenaline would not be secreted by the body, which hardens the flesh and makes it bitter. According to versions of former hitmen of Los Zetas, El Verdugo's favorite way to consume his enemies was in tamales and in tostadas, cooked in lemon as if it were tartar meat. On some occasions, human remains were used to prepare the typical pozole. These infamous recipes were part of the identity of this criminal group, which gained a reputation for being the most sick and savage in all of Mexico. Fortunately for the country, the adventures of this boss came to an end.
Por la noche, la Secretaría de la Marina emitió un comunicado informando que hay indicios de que murió abatido Heriberto Lascano, alias El Lasca, el líder y fundador de Los Zetas.
As we anticipated, the infamous Heriberto Lascano was killed on October 7, 2012, in a confrontation with members of the Mexican Navy in Coahuila. According to the local prosecutor's office, the events took place on Sunday afternoon, near a baseball field in the municipality of Progreso. Alerted by the public to the presence of armed men, members of the Navy tried to stop a suspicious vehicle. According to the then state prosecutor Homero Ramos, the two occupants of the vehicle not only refused to stop but also shot at the Marines. The driver, identified as Alberto Rodriguez, 44 years old, died in the car. The lifeless body of a man who did not have identification documents was found 300 meters from the vehicle. Next to him, an AR-15 rifle with a device to launch grenades. The next day, after comparing fingerprints with national criminal records, it was confirmed that this undocumented individual was Heriberto Lascano, the top leader of Los Zetas and the second most wanted man in the country after Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. Below, we will see an infographic detailing the discoveries made during the autopsy of the victim's body.
El documento establece que el líder de los Zetas murió a causa de 6 disparos de arma de fuego de grueso calibre. Uno en la base inferior izquierda del cráneo. Otro también en la cabeza, que entró en el parietal izquierdo y le fracturó el hueso occipital. 2 más en la zona de los glúteos. Un quinto disparo en el pecho, debajo de la tetilla derecha, que perforó el diafragma y otras zonas del intestino. Y un sexto, arriba del codo derecho, que provocó fracturas múltiples de los huesos de esa zona.
The 6 shots destroyed the executioner. No matter how much power or cruelty one had in life, there is nothing that can stop the deadly trajectory of high-caliber rifle cartridges. The subject was immediately identified, and his shooting became national news, but the story of this criminal was missing one more chapter. After a few days, the Attorney General's office of Coahuila reported that an armed commando stole the body of the boss from the funeral home where it was located. The morbid event occurred in the city of Sabinas. Luckily, the identity had already been confirmed thanks to his fingerprints, otherwise the case would have been even more scandalous. These were the incredible explanations provided by justice.
No había un indicio de la alta peligrosidad del cuerpo, de tal manera que alrededor de las 12:05 de la noche se trasladan los equipos a seguir el trabajo correspondiente a la delegación Sabinas. En ese momento no sabíamos de la existencia de evidencias, como insisto, en transcurso del día, de que fuera Heriberto Lascano.
They simply did not guard the body because no one told them that it was high-priority evidence, the alleged remains of one of the most wanted men in the entire country. Despite the confirmation of identity provided by investigators, some forensic specialists believe that the body did not belong to Heriberto Lascano, since some inconsistencies were found in his weight and other fundamental data. One of them is that the description of the traumatological examination does not match the photographs of the deceased. Another problematic factor is that much information about the capo changes depending on the source consulted. For example, the United States Anti-Drug Agency and the Mexican Navy differ as to his height. While the Americans say he was 1.76, the Mexicans indicated that he was 1.60. In this way, the death of El Verdugo remains, for now, as plagued with mystery and brutality as his life. Before we say goodbye, we would like to add your question to this question. Do you think that the person who died in that shooting was really Heriberto Lascano? Leave us your answer in the comments box. Few organized crime figures have caused as much brutality and horror as this boss. It is likely that, due to his military training, he had a relentless mentality that meant he would not stop until he had finished off his competition. Or he may have just been a psychopath who found in Los Zetas the ideal setting to carry out the most horrifying acts ever recorded. The truth is that more than a decade after his death, his story still has a privileged place in the books on Latin American drug trafficking. This way we come to the end of the video. If you like this content about the main leaders of the cartels, we invite you to subscribe and activate the notifications of our channel. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military Might. Thank you for joining us.